the prophetic calling of Jeremiah. There are so many interesting questions here about the prophets, the prophecies, etc., and the relationship with God in such cases, and so forth. But let's try to follow the lead of the author and see what we can learn from his perspective. So, what do we have here?
A young man called to be a prophet. And in the first chapter of his book, we see that there is a conversation between God and Jeremiah.
It's worth noting that we know about Jeremiah more than we know about any other prophet of the Old Testament. So in your personal study, please spend some time to go more in depth. Jeremiah's work was so important that centuries later we find literature workshops and schools of disciples based on his ministry. However, during his life, he wasn't much appreciated. His message wasn't pleasant to the people and they didn't like it. His life was a miserable one.
It seems to me from the conversation that Jeremiah knew God very well. But what he objected was his qualification for the call of being a prophet. He thought that he was too young or he didn't know how to speak. Interesting. What was the function then of a prophet back at his time? And why was Jeremiah so critical of himself?
The prophet usually has a message that he received one way or another directly from God and that he has to transmit. Sometimes this can be an enjoyable task, make you feel good and superior from someone that God is warning. But if you have to transmit a bad news, a warning, or even condemnation to someone powerful, then it takes guts, and you better make sure that the message comes directly from God, otherwise it's a big risk. So how about Jeremiah?
A little research into the life of Jeremiah reveals that he was a son of a priest from the city of Anathoth, supposedly coming from a very exalted lineage. He grew up knowing God, his promises, the observances in the temple, so most likely he was familiar with the spiritual weight and responsibilities that a God's servant had to carry.
We know that God uses the small and the humble, but in the case of Jeremiah, Paul, and many others, he used people of influence, position, power, and of course with heart open to God. We also learn that God has plans for Jeremiah even before his birth.
And in the dialogue with Jeremiah, God is very patient, very encouraging. The prophet's shortcomings doesn't seem to bother God. He promises his personal intervention in whatever comes in the life of the prophet.
If someone wants to be a prophet and is eager for that, this should be a big warning sign. The consciousness of what it means, of one's worth and capabilities for such mission, is very important. As the author says, the prophet is God's witness. His job is to speak not for himself, but for God alone. Jeremiah wasn't called to find solutions to the problems of the nation, or to become a great personality or charismatic leader whom the people would follow, but to speak for God alone.
And Jeremiah's humility seems to be a magnet for God. And we know of other prophets who demonstrated the same humility when they were asked for God, for service for God. But God's commission is strong and serious, and he promises to put words in the mouth of Jeremiah when he needs it. Also, he's appointed by God to rule over nations and kingdoms, to uproot and tear down, to destroy and overthrow, to build and plant.
And then we have the first vision. There is something terrifying coming from the north, but the first accent is on an almond branch. An almond branch that in Hebrew has the same root as the verb to keep watch that follows in verse 12. God is watching. And there is a message for the people, for the leaders, and for the prophet himself.
Is there a message for us?